Hey, today I'll give a quick talk, and I gave a talk that I gave at a French conference, the French Society for Rural Economy, and today I'm going to talk to you about the land market in Wales and about the impact of the liberal context, as well as subsidy decoupling, and whether or not trying to assess whether or not it has been a challenge for farms to deal with and what kind of impact it had on the sustainability of farms. So just to kind of explain to you the problem, we in the literature we tend to recognize the role that of the land market plays in terms of agricultural development. For example, post-Second World War, there was a lot that was being done around it, either in the UK or in France, to secure family farms into implementing the 20th century agricultural revolution. Except, gradually, as time went on, there was a choice that was made, particularly in the UK, to liberalize the land market after what was deemed a failure of the market, of this very secure market. And when you start to look into it, this was also combined to a very challenging context I've already explained in one of my previous presentations that I did on South Pembrokeshire, for example. And a part of this context was the liberalization of the land market. The problem is, the two together, we witnessed that there's been a big increase in terms of land prices as well as rent prices through time. What it meant is we saw like a 6 or 8-fold increase since 1990s. But even with the very little data available, we kind of realized that there are very different contexts in terms of time frame, as well in terms of landscape where you sit. And it's not. And so far, there has been very little work done on trying to understand these dynamics and how it impacted farm evolution processes. Well, it's quite clear that we had a very strong differentiation of farms that went very different ways since the 1990s from very homogeneous landscape. It's not clear what kind of role the land market played into this. So today I'm going to try to explore this. And for me it's very important to explore it because with Brexit the policy focus is set to evolve, but so far we haven't discussed at all about the land market, which is a concern to me. So, to try to understand this, to try to focus on this, we'll answer 3 different questions. How did the land market liberalization impact farm evolution in Wales, in the wider context of agricultural policy change, and in different conditions, to have the localized aspect? What was the impact of liberalization on the sustainability of farms? What lessons do we need to draw on the eve of a second shock? So, just as to run through, to answer those questions, I used some field work I conducted through the agrarian diagnosis method, which is a very original approach to try to understand the landholding challenge. I'll explain you why, and why it's so peculiar and why it's so adequate to understand the British case. First, the agrarian diagnosis is multidisciplinary. It's usually a very finely grained analysis. You try to understand very, very well a small area. You spend a lot of time there. You do at least around 6 months of field work to understand the area with 3 interlocked phases of field work and analysis on the ground that allow you to understand very well the different scales at which the landscape is integrated and how it interlinks with other things. So obviously you get the historic evolution, but you also get an economic and functioning of the farming system through a quantitatively define qualitative models of the farming system, and this across different landscapes, different conditions. What it's very good for, this kind of tool, is to understand the operating logic and processes of each production system, and most of all, prioritize between them and the different constraints they faced. And you understand, therefore, that it might be very adequate to understand what roles the land market played in relation to the cap reform. And all the more, we'll see it later, given the complexity of the land market in the UK and how it functions, it's very adequate to try to understand its mechanism. To understand, to answer those questions with this method, we have decided to pick two case study areas, one lowland and one upland area that are very different, one lowland South Pembrokeshire and one upland the upper Devienne Valley. So South Pembrokeshire is very much a lowland and very typical of Welsh lowlands. You have hills everywhere, it's very grass focused, you have nearly continuous grass growth, which makes it very good ground to develop a dairy industry, but you also notice it's still relatively diversified. It's overwhelmingly green on the picture, as you can see it, but there's still a bit of a diversity. The landholding context in South Pembrokeshire was mostly farmers-owned. Estates have disappeared over time, quite quickly compared to Bala, where we did the second study area that we have in the northwest Wales upland, where landholding is more of a mix between farmers-owned and some traditional landowners and relatively large landowners, be it traditional estates, NGOs, investment funds, etc. So again, we have a very different context. Pembrokeshire was relatively homogeneous with its yields. We didn't have so much. We had a gradient, yes, but a relatively small gradient in terms of landscape conditions and biophysical conditions for farming. Here, in the uplands around Bala, by the picture you can tell that we have very much different conditions depending on which stage, which step of the agro-ecosystem we are standing on. So I defined three different steps. Three different big agroecological steps. So your first one being the alluvial valley, climbing to the hill, and then the mountain. The higher you go, the rougher it is. The biophysical conditions of the area, as well as its location, played a part in it being specialized on beef and sheep. And as we go down, we have a gradient of meatiness, which is very interesting. Meatiness, meaning the more you go down, the more you have the possibility to reach higher weight for the animal and to make them last, to keep them for longer and to produce more fodder out of your ground. The grass season is much shorter, we have a very different conditions. It's not as good as in South Pembrokeshire, but not that bad either. Right. Before we start delving into trying to understand the most important thing of the functioning of the land market and what happened after 1992, I'd like to just do a quick, to set the scene around the land market, the policy framework around it. First, I'd like to remember you that a lot of policies that still exist in the farming sector today originate from the post-war context, where a secure farming environment was put in place to consolidate family farms and to incentivize them to adopt the 20th century agricultural revolution to produce more food. So as it took, there were a number of policy tools that were used, including market control, subsidies on investment, but it also meant securing the tenure of farms with a heavily regulated tenancy system. Very interesting for the tenant, less so for the landlord. Some public sector farm leases, though it only represented a relatively small part of the acreage, it was still important as a ladder into farming. And from 1980s, the inheritance tax relief for active farmers. There was a gradual move towards farm ownership and towards larger, specialized farm. Contrary to a lot of Western Europe countries like France, there was no need for structural tool to redistribute the landholding, given the agrarian history with the estates that kind of shaped the organization of rural areas, giving a very organized landholding around each farmstead, which is very unlike what we had in France, with very dispersed land all over the place. The goals were very similar to the EEC before the UK joined it, but we will see what happened next when this kind of secure framework began to change. Indeed, from 1992 we had a red big problem. So the CAP went into big problems, which I'm not going to delve into, but basically we had a policy the political context in the UK began to change. So it was a very important time where basically we moved from a secure environment for farm to an increasingly selective one. And the land market, according to me, was under research influence, and I'll try to explain you what changed during that time. Okay, so from 1992 we had gradual liberalization of the market environment around food production, and the CAP began to switch its support from production to something a bit more multifunctional, except it went relatively gradually in Wales, because we first moved towards coupled payment by a head of cattle or by your production amount for milk or arable, and gradually towards historical references of the farm. The more you got in the past, the more you add, and finally towards a flat rate payment. The more acreage you have, the more you get. And this was only partially compounded by the second pillar schemes, with agro-environmental schemes paying for public goods. You do things for the environment or considered good for the environment, you abide by the prescriptions, or you do things, you plant trees or build fence, and you can get points, or you can get into a scheme and you can get a management payment or a capital payment. But this was relatively selective in terms of which farm could access it. We also had the organic payments that were introduced, as well as other programs. But on the landholding, big changes started to happen. First, there was a gradual phasing out of county council farms. You remember the public lease farms, the public lease that I was talking about, they were starting to be wound down due to mostly to financial constraints. And the secure tenancies were scrapped, and a new type of tenancy, more flexible and more landlord favorable, the fixed business, the farm business tenancy, 1995, were introduced on the consensus around the industry. But the context was even more challenging, given the fact that, to expand, farms now had to pay quotas if they wanted to increase their numbers, either in terms of number of cows or livestock, or just to increase their amount of milk they were producing. And quotas, contrary to other countries, were tradable as commodities. Basically, the interesting thing is, the context I've described now, partly around the market, is way more liable to crisis than it was before. But did the land market was such a big impact? Was it such a big change at that time? It was not. Basically, if we start to look into it, the land market, what changed was the formal tenancies that were on relatively long term. The FBT introduced the possibility to rent out bare land for more institutional kind of landlords without or landlords without going through an AEHA kind of very secure tenancies and a very long-term tenancy which was not particularly adequate to deal with kind of bare land renting out. Also, we can see the focus in terms of power through this, but there were loads of options that could be explored outside formal leases or inside formal kind of agreements that could be taken up by the user. What you could see is like grazing license, gentleman agreements were already available. They were kind of short to medium and were giving power to the landlord. So we have to question ourselves as well, why didn't they kick in sooner? Why weren't they used a lot by farms to increase the number of farms? And you'll see that finally, I'll try to explain this to you later. Finally, on the formal agreements, contract farming, share farming, or partnerships were already there, mostly used by large landowner in order not to lose all their land or to get into better terms than AHA without renting as grazing license relatively large acreage. And it allowed some large landowner to hold on to their land by doing this. The further expansion was difficult to do via renting, because you did via renting, particularly via formal renting, And on the flip side, I think the most problem around before the 1995 reform was more due to the reduced supply available, be it because some would not lease out, but also because many farms were around, simply. And we'll see that this started to change just after 1992. Finally, these slides really show how complicated it is to follow the landholding and the land market in the UK, particularly the renting market. Given the wide span of agreement, it's very difficult to keep track of what kind of agreements are done at what time, what kind of prices, what kind of conditions. It's very flexible. Even before the FBT's introduction, it was flexible. So I'll try to explain to you the historical approach to differentiation of farms and the land market. So, first phase that I'd like to talk to you about is from 1992 to 2003. We had low output prices, low input prices, coupled subsidies, the more you produce the more you get. But we noticed that gradually rent and land prices started to increase gradually. So we'll try to explore this. Basically, you have to remember that around this time there were a lot of barriers to expansion. Quotas that you had to pay for, high borrowing cost, and also extremely challenging markets for different range of reasons, BSE or foot and mouth, or like crisis on beef or sheep, but on dairying it was mostly due to market factors. But the FBT's introduction, as well as cheap inputs, changed kind of the mix. It allowed a very narrow window to expand. No need to buy as much. You can rent, and rent a lot more. And on the flip side, on the supply side, if you're about to retire and you're in a very difficult context because of the prices have crashed, maybe you can retire and you can rent out your land nearly risk-free through the FBTs that give you a lot of power to other farmers, those that are trying to expand. It's all the truer on dairying area, mostly because on milk you could lease out the quotas as well. On the demand side, there were responses to maintain remuneration, was to expand and try to increase input use, try to increase output, increase labor productivity. The main difference was either people would go for a fast or a slow increase. I'll just try to focus now on whether we witnessed a different context between uplands and lowlands. So in Pembrokeshire we had more retirement, an increased supply of rented land available. There were more retirement or pre-retirement possibilities, and we had again the two fast or slow expansion possibilities for people. With already different strategies. The fact that we had a lot of retirements and a lot of people going out of the industry, around 40% of dairy farm in David disappeared between 1992 and 2003, which is very impressive. It enabled the return of potato farming that needed a specific kind of grade of land and a specific kind of rotation. There was a lot of demand as well around, which explains the rise in prices. In Bala, we had less retirements compared to lowlands, mostly because the subsidy around beef and sheep were way more supportive and way better to deal with in terms of production. So there was a lower demand as well for land, given the fact that in uplands they were just finishing to implement the productivity gains out of the 20th century agricultural revolution. So for them it was just, oh yes, we're climbing the ladder, we're improving the productivity, the intensity of what we have, and we are starting as well to gradually expand. So we only had very big expanding demand from farms with a very large family. On the flip side, on the mountain, we still had some people that were going out of farming, but less and less so, given the fact that second pillar scheme were targeting a lot the mountain and were compensating the disadvantage of this area. And but we still had some land sales around this area. We noticed that the land supply was not the same the responses to this land supply were not the same. In Pembrokeshire, we already had like kind of a tight market. Land would be split, But this was not the case in the uplands. You could still buy whole farms. So it's very interesting to witness that. Phase 2 and Phase 3 offer a very different context. For Phase 2, at low input cost, they started to rise very rapidly from 2008. We also witness that prices started to fluctuate. Not increased really, but fluctuating really more. While at the same time we had a massive land price increase, while rented land didn't increase as much. So we tend to see two phases, one from 2003 2013 and the one after as a decoupling and the increase in terms of input price from 2008, which is interesting to witness. So on the historical approach, we had way less barriers to expansion there, because this was gradually the quotas were not effective anymore, given the fact that a lot of farms had been going out of production. So more like the value of the quotas went down relatively quickly on milk, beef and sheep. Not that they mattered a lot in the past on beef and sheep. And the borrowing costs gradually went down, partially after 2008. But we had fluctuating markets and inputs that could be more costly than before. Therefore, with the fact that you had subsidies that would be attached to land, it was kind of interesting to buy land. And to buy land kind of a lot. And more interesting than renting, particularly if you were dependent on subsidies. So, on the supply side, we had the lesser supply of land, particularly to sell. Because it was less and less interesting to sell, it was more interesting to retain your land and to rent out your land and claim and get the subsidy back, without necessarily being an active farmer in real life, not to the eye of the cap, not from the cap point of view. We had very much a retirement wave on beef and sheep, particularly in the uplands, not so much on dairying. And on the demand side, we had an increased pressure from a lot of buyers over partly out of farming buyers, that in some areas had started earlier but really kicked in around that time for Pembrokeshire and Bala a lot more, with maybe more conflict around with them as well. So the farm responses were very much different to maintain a remuneration, given the context was a bit less challenging, with an expansion but as well differentiation in terms of product type, or to try to go for a higher income. Again, we also witnessed a different kind of orientation, with more and more people going part-time, or trying to diversify to maintain their income, which was something that was unheard of before. In Pembrokeshire, both the areas would have part-time and diversification, but in Pembrokeshire we had a less and less supply, for a supply that was already tight. We had more farms that were around there compared to Bala in terms of density already, and there was a continuous demand for land from different systems, which was kind of challenging. We witnessed an uninterrupted increase in terms of price on land and leases in dairying area, which is not the case of the uplands, as we will see in a moment. And so the amount of formal leases concluding started to be very low, and the case of only couple large landowner mostly, or kind of amicable leases, but it was relatively low amount of those, because it was way more interesting to keep the subsidy, or like to keep the control, to be able to hold market power. The only way for beef and sheep farms to access the market would be to go into amicable leases, so opportunity, trying, people that would be attached to the land and would give it to a trusted farmer or someone they trust and know they needs land and will manage it correctly, or put some condition in terms of maintenance, etc., etc. In Bala, in the uplands, we witnessed a lot more retirements versus the lowlands, mostly in the valley and on the hills, not so much on the mountain, due to the fact that we had more and more second pillar scheme increasing. Sales we actually stopped on the mountain in terms of how much they were sold, how much land was sold, at least directly. And overall, we had an higher offer. That was that explains a different kind of rent value kind of trajectory compared to the lowlands, and as well as not only linked to the biophysical conditions. So for Pembrokeshire, we're looking at something that can go up sometimes to 350 or more, possibly 400 pound to the hectare, and for Bala we would be a maximum, I would say around 350 to the hectare, which is the maximum, and around the maximum most people are paying less. So it's much more of a slacker market in terms of offer, but the demand is still relatively high. All the more in the later years, where we've seen the development of new high demand, highly demanding farming systems on high added value production that can fork out the money, but also need quite often specific types of land. That's what I'll try to cover now. This was just a summary of the graph, explaining kind of the different position of our actors depending on what they were doing. If you're expanding relatively fast, you will probably go more for commercial rent and or doing it secondly on a form opportunistic. But as people know you're expanding fast, you need land to feed your livestock. To get further in, you would pay a higher rent, and often at informal high-risk agreements, which is not the case if you're expanding slower or if you're in a stability move. Then it's more of a case-by-case strategy, depending on where you sit, what you need exactly, what is your farming system plans, etc., etc. So we see really two big strategy: fast expansion, relatively slow expansion. And now more and more we see some specific strategy with some systems that need definite kind of specific types of land to operate the farming system, and therefore they are requiring, they are quite specific, and they are ready to pay the price, and they can pay the price for this kind of types of land. We also see the evolution in terms of retiring or reducing people that rent out their land. Basically, and how they evolved, and how they what was their strategy through time, which is quite different. And we also see more and more the rise of subcontracting as a fact that linked to the expansion, very fast expansion of some farms, a very much needed thing, or subcontracting parts of the farming system to other farms. Just to finish on the historical analysis, I was to touch base on the fact that certain types of farms need certain types of land, or that you have a very strong influence of the land holding pattern on the development, directly linked to the land markets being available, and the fact of laissez-faire and absence of structural tool, like land control, land purchase, or land rent control. For example, on dairying, dairy spring calving herds really need, that are very developing quite fast, particularly in North Wales. They need certain biophysical conditions, definitely. Most likely some certain relief, even if they're relatively flexible. But most of all, they need a grouped grazing platform. They can deal with outlying land to rear heifers or to produce some silage, but they need a grazing platform big enough for their 300 to 500 dairy cows. Even if they're relatively small, it's a big acreage that you need, maybe let's say 150 hectares, maybe possibly more, depending on what you need, and only certain landholders can give it. And they would give it, but for a price, so it calls for a higher land rent, land value remuneration to the landowner. Secondly, on dairying, high inputs, high output system that grew very fast, that expanded very fast. Well, they have a lot of land that is relatively dispersed usually, and the more land dispersed, the smaller usually your grazing platform, and you try to expand, and it kind of spirals into a system that is more and more inside. A system as well that needs to pay higher and higher land value remuneration. Finally, we also have organic farms. Organic farms need more acreage to farm organically with a similar number of animals, but they also need a relatively group supply sometimes, and will be possibly at times pickier in terms of quality of land. To give you an idea, on the uplands you might need to go organic, sometimes 3 times more land. This is relatively big, and you need a secure tenancy, because otherwise, because you're going to build up the fertility and it's kind of the land, etc., and it's going to be a long-term process, and you need to have the subsidy to support your activity. On beef and sheep, the low remuneration that you get out of the price of the market makes you restricts you in terms of what kind of land you can have access to, what kind of rent you can pay, or what kind of but even if you get good subsidy, what kind of land you can pay, except if you need this block of land because it's a perfect place for your farming system. But overall, beef and sheep system can operate a relatively dispersed supply of land, but they still require sometimes some relatively big blocks depending on the herd, on the flock. That can constrain your farming system also. So as you can see, we have different profiles, different interactions with the land market. Each and every farm has a different strategy, which is very interesting to understand. And you can clearly guess that we will have very different land rent values that will be paid by farm in terms of land remuneration. Just to touch base, I'm going to switch to the economic analysis. So as you can see, with the agrarian diagnosis, we are focused on the long-term family farm approach to economic performance. And what I'm going to look at today is comparing the added value as well as the actual revenue to how much rent farms pay and how much subsidies they tend to get per hectare. And as you can see, in the uplands, beef and sheep farm, we can clearly explain why it's difficult for them to pay the rent. In terms of added value, it often barely covers or not covers at all the rent they tend to pay for their land. So how do we explain it? How do we explain it that they can rent? Well, usually the land rent is first slightly smaller than what we can see to the right on Pembrokeshire, and secondly, they rely mostly on subsidy. So it's more of an opportunistic, amicable kind of renting than just a highest bidder approach. On the flip side, the developing high added value productions tend to usually have a slightly higher rent to pay, except the poultry farm, for design reasons, but they can pay a higher value for a rent value for a lot of their land. And they can pay the higher value, and the subsidy and the land might be stripped of its subsidy usually. So two very different profiles, even though we can see that clearly it's not easy to rent. So how do we explain that the sheep mountain farm only is renting a bit of land, even if it loses money out of its economic activity? It's very simple. It's been a choice to preserve autonomy by renting in more land to produce fodder by themselves, and the subsidy kind of pays for it. So it explains how we got there. On the lowlands, we have a very different situation. First, you can have a look at the organic farms. Like we see that the rents are much higher overall, except for some of the beef and sheep system, which are quite close to what is being paid in the upland, kind of reinforcing the thesis of we have a highest bidder approach, and we have like kind of an amicable opportunity kind of renting market, a two-sided one really. And we can also see that we have much higher level of rents, reflecting the better biophysical conditions usually, as well as a tighter land market over there. Most of the supply of land in many cases is stripped of its subsidy, particularly for dairy farms, the biggest dairy farms. And we can see that even for beef, for organic dairy farms as well as small dairy farms can pay the rent that they're being asked to pay, either by their added value or actual revenue, but it's not the case of beef and sheep system. We can, even for the organic one, there's a big problem in terms of in terms of they're really depending on subsidy to subsist, and they need kind of some subsidy to be attached to the land. So they can only take a certain amount of rent to pay. They can only pay a certain amount of rent, and there must be a tilting point around there. Rent levels are adjusted overall to the added value of the farming system, and we can clearly see, I hope I've clearly shown you here, that we have a two-speed renting market. So now I'd like to conclude rapidly on what we witnessed. The land market has been an important driver of farm evolutions. It played a big part in farm differentiation and expansion, but also retirement. So clearly the phase one of historical, we see that we have very different strategy that kind of impacted what farms were able to do later, and you can be trapped into some logic or your farming system that you want to put in place can require some kind of land holding that kind of place it can be specific to get into the land market and requires a premium, or on the flip side you can be required to pay your premium because of your profile. So it's very interesting. The opportunity to kind of expand, build on land, rent, build on land, buying more land is mostly built around the tax framework, because something I haven't mentioned so much is the fact that the tax framework really incentivizes in the UK the fact that you buy land, you buy as much land as possible. It's been partly the case on beef and sheep farm, maybe less on dairy farms that depend more on renting. For example, there's no land tax in the UK to pay every year, and as I was mentioning, the inheritance tax relief is virtually exempts you from paying paying inheritance tax on capital. We had the emergence of a two-speed land market, but the highest bidder strategy dominates. All the more given the fact that we have specific needs from specific system, and we have a continuously competitive context for land access, which is particularly a problem for new entrants into farming, particularly landless entrants into farming, that can only go in certain production, added value productions. The laissez-faire and rundown of the few structural tools that existed in a liberal context that was kind of pre-existing, really, enabled this extreme differentiation and specialization of farms, with choices increasingly trapping farming system and increasing dependence on inputs and higher labor productivity, which is kind of a problem. So if we look at the future, because we are looking at a very different kind of scheme for farm support in the future, as well as a different context economically, there's a clear willingness by the Welsh government to set out a scheme helping to develop sustainable farming systems. Except, sustainable farming system often requires stability over the farm's period of operation, as has been shown by the literature. And for we provide stability, mostly, on the land market for family farms. It's mostly one-sided. There's no maximum threshold or help around, like maximum threshold or structural tool that could help alleviate the problems that we witness of very scarce supply on land market, or very high risk, let's put high risk for farms overall, and it just doesn't seem right within the demand, because the new Welsh government scheme will need farms to commit for a long time, and this might be difficult to do with such a high risk and high risk kind of land holding on a number of farms, particularly the ones that have the highest added value and that have the highest land use intensity. It will most likely clash with drivers of the land market or drivers of the market as well. It's not how it works for now with a two-speed land market, and it's either one way or the other, as there's relatively little middle ground for now. And we have the lack of consistent, independent monitoring data really is a problem. Here we have a good baseline of how it's functioning, different interlinking in the landscape, into a specific landscape, and we can grow out of it and get some wider insight, but we still need quantitative data. We need clear data to know the number of agreements that are being concluded, formal or informal, the length of them, how risky they are, because it will determine definitely the future of Welsh farming and the response to the SFS, be it because of commitment, security, or be it because of economics and land market drivers. I hope you find it in my talk interesting. If you have any questions, please get in touch. In the meantime, I don't know what would be the answer to this land market problem for now, but we need to reflect carefully if we want an agroecological transition, and if we want our farms to be sustained and the rural environment to be sustained. There might be some things and policy instruments that need to be tweaked or added to the toolbox, and maybe to better adapt to the conditions, to the challenges that we're witnessing. Thanks.